On August 28, 2025, the state of Florida carried out its ninth execution of the year. The man strapped to the gurney was Curtis Windom, a name tied to one of the most violent killing sprees Orlando had ever seen. Tonight, we'll revisit his chilling crimes, the decades-long legal battle, and the final moments that ended in lethal injection. Before we dive into this case, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a deep dive into the real stories behind America's death row. November 1992. Orlando was winding down for the night when sudden bursts of gunfire shattered the quiet. In the middle of it all was 34-year-old Curtis Windom, a man whose rage had been simmering beneath the surface for months. His relationship with his estranged girlfriend had collapsed into bitterness and arguments. But on that night, the tension boiled over in a way no one in the neighborhood could have imagined. It began inside her home. What should have been a heated domestic dispute turned into something far deadlier. Windom arrived armed, his anger spilling into violence. Within moments, his estranged girlfriend was gunned down, leaving friends and neighbors stunned. But the bloodshed didn't stop there. Fueled by fury, he turned his weapon on two more victims, cutting down lives in what prosecutors would later describe as an execution-style slaughter. Neighbors who survived recalled the chaos in chilling detail. Some remembered diving to the floor as bullets tore through walls and windows. Others described the shriek of sirens racing through the night, the flashing blue and red lights reflecting off houses as officers scrambled to contain the carnage. Families huddled inside their homes, terrified that the gunman might come for them next. By the time police secured the scene, 3 people were dead. What stood out to investigators wasn't just the body count. It was the cold, deliberate way the murders had been carried out. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment shooting, they said, but an ambush fueled by rage and control. Orlando had seen violent crimes before, but nothing like this. The brutality of Windom's spree left the city shaken, its residents struggling to process how quickly an ordinary evening had turned into a blood-soaked nightmare. The rampage had barely ended before police closed in on Curtis Windom. Officers responding to frantic 911 calls swarmed the neighborhood, guided by terrified witnesses who pointed them toward the gunman. Windom, still armed, was subdued and taken into custody without further bloodshed. For many in Orlando, his arrest brought a fleeting sense of relief. At least the man who had unleashed such terror was no longer roaming free. From the beginning, investigators built a straightforward case. They recovered the firearm, secured witness statements, and pieced together the timeline of events. The picture that emerged was chilling. Windom had not stumbled into violence in a haze of confusion. He had come prepared. Prosecutors would later emphasize that point, saying he deliberately armed himself before confronting his estranged girlfriend, knowing full well the confrontation could end in blood. When the trial opened, the courtroom was heavy with tension. Families of the victims filled the benches, clutching photographs and holding hands as prosecutors laid out the grim details. They described how Windom's anger had metastasized into a deadly plan, one fueled by jealousy, resentment, and a need for control. To the jury, it was painted as nothing short of calculated murder. The defense took a different approach. They acknowledged the killings, but urged the jury to see Windom through a different lens, arguing that his mind was fractured, that mental instability had driven him into a spiral he couldn't control. But their pleas fell flat against the weight of evidence and the horror of the crime itself. After days of testimony, the jury returned a verdict: guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder. Their recommendation was swift and decisive. Curtis Windom should be sentenced to death. The judge agreed, formally sending him to Florida's death row. For the families of the victims, it was a bittersweet moment. Justice delivered, but the pain of their loss still raw and permanent. After the verdict was handed down, Curtis Windom was transported to Florida State Prison, the same stark complex where so many of the state's most notorious killers have waited out their final years. There, he entered the routine that defines life on death row: 6 by 9 foot cells, limited human contact, and endless time to replay the past. For more than 3 decades, Windom lived under that shadow. Every day began and ended behind steel doors, with the ever-present knowledge that his sentence was death. Like many condemned prisoners, he turned to the courts, launching appeal after appeal. His lawyers challenged the conviction itself, arguing constitutional violations, claiming ineffective representation, and pressing the courts to reconsider his mental state at the time of the killings. But each petition hit the same wall. Judges reviewed the evidence, weighed the arguments, and ultimately rejected them. The brutality of the crime, the deliberate preparation, and the jury's clear decision made it nearly impossible to shake the original ruling. Every denial pushed Windom further into obscurity, his name appearing in legal briefs and court dockets, but rarely in the headlines. As time passed, Florida carried out executions of other inmates, and new cases captured the public's attention. Windom's story, once a shocking headline, slowly faded into the background. Yet for the victims' families, his case never truly disappeared. Every appeal was a reminder of the night they lost their loved ones. And for Windom himself, the reality never changed. The execution date might not yet be set, but it was always looming, waiting, inevitable. By the summer of 2025, after more than 3 decades of legal wrangling, Curtis Windom's time had run out. In early August, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed his death warrant, setting the date of execution for August 28. With that single stroke of a pen, all the years of delay collapsed into a countdown measured not in years or months, but in hours and minutes. Prison officials transferred Windom from his regular death row cell to what is known as Death Watch, a stark area just steps away from the state's execution chamber. It is here that condemned inmates spend their final 3 days, watched around the clock by guards. Every move is logged, every visitor closely monitored. The Death Watch cell is both a place of confinement and a constant reminder of what is coming. Guards who observed him in those last days described his demeanor as calm, even resigned. Unlike some who lash out or cling to hope until the last moment, Windom seemed to accept his fate. He spent his final hours in quiet routine, eating simple meals, meeting briefly with his spiritual advisor, and saying little. His last meal request was never made public, a detail that would remain in shadow, unlike many executions where such requests become morbid trivia. When August 28th arrived, the ritual unfolded as it always does. At around 6 p.m., Windom was led into the brightly lit execution chamber, strapped onto the gurney, and hooked to intravenous lines. Behind the glass, witnesses sat in silence. Family members of the victims, officials, and media observers. Asked if he had any final words, Windom offered only a short, quiet statement, nothing elaborate or memorable, before closing his eyes. Moments later, the chemicals flowed. His breathing slowed, his chest rising and falling in shallow rhythm until it stopped altogether. At 6:15 p.m., Curtis Windom was pronounced dead, bringing an end to one of Florida's longest-standing death row cases. For some, it was justice long overdue. For others, it was another reminder of how the machinery of capital punishment grinds forward, slow, relentless, and final. When the warden announced Curtis Windom's death at 6:15 p.m. on August 28, 2025, the chapter that had begun on a blood-soaked November night in 1992 was officially closed. For the families of the 3 victims, it had taken more than 30 years of waiting, court hearings, and repeated appeals before justice was finally carried out. Outside the prison walls, some expressed relief, describing a sense of weight lifted after decades of uncertainty. One relative told reporters that while nothing could bring their loved ones back, at least the system finally finished what it started. Windom's execution also carried a broader significance. It marked Florida's 9th execution in 2025, a number that startled many observers. The pace was unusually high, even for a state long known for using the death penalty aggressively. Each execution seemed to follow the next with little pause, creating a year in which Florida was setting a national tone for capital punishment. But not everyone viewed it as justice served. Critics pointed to the speed of Governor DeSantis' signed warrants and questioned whether the state was pushing executions through too quickly. They raised concerns not only about the condemned, but also about the toll such a rapid succession of executions took on prison staff who carried them out and on victims' families who were forced to relive their trauma again and again in the glare of media coverage. In the end, Curtis Windom's story became more than just a grim recounting of 3 murders in Orlando. His case became part of a larger narrative about Florida's use of the death penalty, one that sparked debates over justice, closure, and the human cost of executions. For some, his death closed a wound that had festered since 1992. For others, it underscored how heavy the price is when the state itself takes a life, even when justice demands it. If you found this breakdown compelling, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe justice was finally served, or does the decades-long delay raise bigger questions about America's death penalty system?